Hello everyone. My name is Suzie Prince. I'm head of product for DevOps at Atlassian, and you're here with our DevOps live stream again. And today we are welcomed by and joined by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais, who are the authors of Team Topologies. So great to have you both here. There it is. There's the book. Well known at Atlassian. I know many of our teams have read it, especially product managers on our DevOps teams, very familiar and excited to have you with us today. Can you care to give us a little more intro? Matthew, let's start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. My background is as a software developer. I started in 2001 writing software for brain scanning machines. And then I moved into online web technologies and things, and local government, and then financial systems. And then increasingly got involved in helping organizations to be more effective at building and running the software, starting actually from kind of what was then, back in 2011, something that's quite new, continuous delivery. We're all pretty familiar with it now, but concept of deployment pipelines, things like this, good source code management, that kind of thing. But then kind of expanding out from there really and thinking about, well, okay, we've got this value stream, part of the value stream quite well defined in a deployment pipeline. What sits outside that? And some of that thinking led me to think to some of the early thoughts about teams and responsibility boundaries and things like this. And then collaborating with Manuel, we ended up getting to the point where we said, okay, let's write this book.
Great. And Manuel, would you like to tell us some more about yourself as well?
First, thanks for having us here. It's great. And I also have a background in computer science, also about 20 years in the industry. I had a number of different roles throughout my career. I started as developer, tester, build and release engineer, team lead. And so I was also drawn to continuous delivery and DevOps when it came out, because that all kind of made sense in terms of, sort of connecting the dots, because I had seen how many organizations were really organized in silos, and then it was very difficult to get information across different teams. There was a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of rework and all those things that we now have a better understanding from work like Accelerate from Dr. Nicole Forsgren and others. And so I was drawn to that. And then I started working with Matthew, consulting for various clients on continuous delivery and DevOps. And then we would often encounter other problems around lack of clarity on teams, purpose, and so all sorts of stories where teams were lacking appropriate sort of interactions and being expected to do things that they were not aware of even. So and here we are now with Team Topologies.
Yeah, and it sounds like teams became your passion. And for us at Atlassian, we try to think about, teams as the center of what we're doing. In fact, our tagline is to unleash the potential in every team. And I think that is one of the things that you're trying to do with the book. Can you tell us how? I'm sure that's why everybody's joined the live stream today. It's like, how do you move towards like being the best team and therefore organization that you can be? I don't know who would like to start. Manuel,
it's a good question. I think one of the things that people say about Team Topologies, the book, is that it provides clear language. It provides a set of patterns that helps the whole organization to communicate well. And I think it's that level of clarity which is the starting point for making teams more effective. Define what your mission as a team is. Try and work out what kind of team you are, because not all teams are the same. Get some definition, get some clarity and definition, and work towards a clear definition of purpose and ways of working and that kind of thing. And that in itself helps, because so many teams are really struggling with a lack of purpose, a lack of clarity about how they should kind of communicate and interact with other teams. and just getting to that point of defining something around the teams can really help. And it's more than that, but that's a really useful starting point.
We've seen with different clients we've helped. That's clearly a problem for many teams, where we can tell because teams don't know if they're sort of platform team or complicated system, and often that's because they haven't kind of dig deeper into, who are our customers, what are we actually supposed to provide, rather than just taking in requests and responding to requests. Actually, what is the value of providing to whoever the customers are? And so if we don't even know who our customers are, whether they are external or internal, then it's going to be difficult to have clarity on, why are we here? Why do we exist as a team? Because there's always work, there's always sort of infinite work, but is this work actually aligned to some sort of value we're providing? And then just one more thing, which we don't talk about explicitly in the book, but we've written an article that covers that a little bit, is the fact that there's team purpose and mission, and there's individual purpose, right? So in many organizations, that's sort of forgotten. Like, every individual has different aspirations, different things they want to learn or do. And so if you have the teams kind of more clearly defined, what kind of work do we do, what value provide, then you can better align also the individuals with those types of teams. So I just had this conversation the other day with a client where they said, well, people in this sort of platform team, but some of the people are really very interested in the customer experience, the end customer experience. So that maybe is not the best fit. Maybe they would be better placed in a streamlined team, because they are interested in getting feedback, improving the experience for the end user. It's always a balance, because you need to focus on customers on any team, but like a platform team, especially if it's more kind of the lower type of services in terms of being more infrastructure level, then probably you need people you tend to have people who are more interested on the technology, and that's fine. We should be aware that there are different individual interests, and then the team types also help align with that and get people to, be more motivated basically and perform better.
Yeah, and I think this in the book you talk about like this people first, like team first thinking. I think that's what you're both talking about there, where the teams have to, ask like, what is our purpose, and then also the individuals need to feel like they fit in that. How do you really see that differs from? I mean, I think for a lot of people it might be very obvious, but how do you? A lot of what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about a lot of managers might ask their direct reports, oh, what would you like? But I think you're talking about something more than that, than an individual manager. It's a whole change for the organization. How does that really sort of manifest itself?
That's a good question. So in lots of organizations, you get, let's say, maybe it's product or maybe it's managers or project managers, and they take a hyper individualized, hyper command and control approach to the work. They go and walk up. I mean, when they're in the office or if it's online, they'll ping them directly on the messenger app.
Yeah.
They'll say, "Hey, can you do this piece of work for me? It should take you about 8 hours." Speaking directly to one person, micromanaging multiple different people completely separately, which isolates people. That means they can't learn. It means that we can't take collective responsibility for, say, a service or application, because each person has been building tiny little fragments that then no one really knows how these properly assemble together. And effectively the project managers or the people who are assigning those tiny bits of work are effectively sort of starting to design the software system because of things like kind of socio-technical mirroring. So it's an incredibly bad approach. It's incredibly unaware approach to software development, but it's very, very common having people kind of just drop specific tasks or chunks of work into individual engineers. What's a much better approach, given that we know things about things like socio-technical mirroring, sometimes called Conway's law, is let's actually make sure we're thinking much more explicitly and consciously about the the kind of shape of teams and the shape of interactions between different teams, because that will have a strong effect on the kind of architectures that we're likely to build. The second reason really for thinking about teams is a team, if it's high performing and working as a proper team, i.e. we've taken the time to build trust, that unit will be much more high performing than just a group of individuals with the same manager. And we want to be high performing, because if we're not, then our competition will be. So we're trying to aim for a fast flow of change. We want to be high performing, and therefore we want high trust inside a group of people that is building some stuff. That means a team. And so that's the reason we take the team as the kind of fundamental starting point. We can have a much high degree of trust, and therefore a much faster flow of change if we use teams rather than just multiple different individuals.
Another example where you tend to see many organizations where even kind of some specific aspects like training, for example, where it tends to be you have a training budget per individual. And so there is a sort of, and sometimes, there's also tooling that's focused on individuals rather than teams. So when we're saying team first approach, we're not just saying nice to have. It's really treat the team as the entity, the unit that you, like Matthew said, that you can rely for high performance. It's kind of, I don't know if it's contradicting, but you need to let the team grow. You need to support the team to grow, but at the same time, you need to treat the team as the entity, not the individuals inside the team. And so when you have HR deciding, for example, individual training budget, that's not necessarily in the best interest of the team, because maybe we couldn't get someone who is really good at attending training or conferences and bring back the knowledge, because that person already exceeded their individual training budget, when actually that would be useful for the team, and maybe other people in the team are not so interested. And like I said, also maybe in tooling, for example, where maybe we need to have tooling that supports the idea of teams, not just individuals, not just individual users, but actually, I don't know, we assign some work is the responsibility of this team, not of an individual. So it's really across the board, if you like, and it's quite new for many organizations that thinking of a team is not just saying that is actually, where are the places where we need to think of teams instead of individuals.
Yeah, it's making me, last time in our live stream, we talked to Patrick Dubois, and he was talking about how you create a culture of trust. And it seems to me being able to, make it team first as opposed to individual first really requires that team to have a high level of trust. In your example, which I think is a really, really great one of the training, how do the team trust that one individual is going to go to the conference and bring back the knowledge for the group as opposed to for themselves? Can you talk to us a little bit about how you build that trust in a team, and what are kind of the stepping stones to what is probably like quite a long journey, I expect?
There's quite a lot of awareness and understanding about kind of team building and how trust is built within teams. There's some of the earlier research around kind of forming, storming, norming, performing stuff is perhaps people realize now that that's not as simple.
Not so linear.
It's not so linear. It's more continuous. But the way in which teams kind of form and work has been pretty well studied. So we deliberately didn't include too much about that in the book.
Yes.
However, we can definitely learn a lot from how groups in particularly kind of military and emergency services situations learn and adapt and work together. Also, things like medical situations, particularly if they're doing emergency surgery, things like that. There's a lot of practices there to learn from. But I've forgotten what I was going to say. What I was going to say now.
But I think the learning is... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go for it, Manuel. Yeah, go for it.
I think the learning is key, right? So you're setting up the teams to grow. So it's, having a high performing teams is not something that you can decide and do it. Like you what you need is sort of like growing your garden or your plants. You need to nurture it, and then over time they're gonna grow if they have the right conditions. Also internally, obviously, it's not all just what's outside the team, but internally the team needs to gel and to mature over time. So the Tuckman model that Matthew was referencing, it helps us give an idea, and it actually says that performing or high performing comes at later stages. So you need time, you need stable teams, and you need what we call long-lived teams or durable teams, so that they can grow that trust inside over time. And then, but the learning is also key, because there will be decisions made where we will learn as a team, was this a good decision or not? Should we have sent this person to the training, or actually we should have done it in a different way? We should have had, I don't know, some other sort of help. So, but you're giving the teams the tools to learn and actually then make better decisions over time. And that's why it takes time, and it's a growth perspective. It's not a kind of deciding on the right model or the right teams.
Yeah, it feels like it requires time and then feedback, which we know is important in, obviously the whole DevOps cycle, the whole thing, but with individuals as well. I'm going to do a thing. We're going to decide if that, reflect on that and maybe change it in the future. I know
to be able to do that, please. It's important that the team actually is able to own and run what it's working on. If their responsibility, if the team's responsibility is just building something that they never really understand how the implications, if they never see how users use it, if there's no responsibility for running that thing, it's very disengaging. If their responsibility is far too big, and the team's always kind of really, really stressed because they can't actually properly own that software because there's too much to think about.
Yes.
Then you'll have a problem there as well. To make this stuff work, we have to start thinking about what we call team cognitive load, effectively about the size of software that we're asking teams to work on. A team there's been research done in the context of I think it was in the US Navy in particular, groups of teams that are stressed start to dissolve back into individuals. And so we need to be mindful of that. If we want a high performance, we actually have to start thinking about the size of software systems in terms of their relationship to team cognitive load and the ability of teams to actually run work on these things. So that relates to the high trust in the team as well, because if you overload a team effectively with too much stuff, too much responsibility, too much detail, whatever, then the trust will start to break down. So there's a lot of factors and dynamics at play here that organizations in the past have just kind of ignored or weren't really aware of. And now the organizations that are really succeeding and able to go very quickly are thinking about these kind of things, multiple different aspects to how we build software.
Yes, and that's talking about the dynamics within the individual team, which sounds, even that itself has, requires some learning. I'm curious, when you say long-lived, how long do you think a team really needs to kind of go on that journey? Months or years even? What have you seen the most, like examples of the most successful?
Yeah, it's typically will take several months. So obviously depends on specific teams, but just to, when you start the team up to the point where they have some sort of trust, it will take likely about, half a year, something like that. Obviously with variations. And so that's also why it's so damaging when we still see organizations that kind of treat teams as sort of replaceable units, where we can have a team for a project and then we stop the team and then we move people around to other teams. And you're constantly losing that kind of the process of becoming, a gelled team rather than a group of individuals. So that still happens quite frequently, unfortunately. The other question that people tend to ask, does this mean that a stable, long-lived team that will never be, that we need to stay with the same people all the time? And that's also not very practical, right? Because people, change their interests. And again, we need to cater to the individual interests as well. Or there might be changes in the business or in the market that mean, well, actually, what we're doing here is no longer valuable. But we still think of the team as a long-lived unit, right? Even if people come and go. And so there are other books like Dynamic Reteaming, for example, is really good around how do we make changes to teams in a sustainable way from a human perspective, from helping teams kind of evolve when that's needed. But we don't treat the teams as sort of a disposable entity that we can use for a project and then get rid of. So we rather keep the team stable and bring the work to the teams, even if they're working on a stream that now is less valuable, and so we need to work on something else. But we should still retain, if possible, the team as a valuable, gelled group of people who work well together now.
There is a great book in this space called Dynamic Reteaming. It's by Heidi Helfand. This talks about the practicalities of making the kind of a refreshment of the kind of personnel on the team. How to go about doing that without kind of destroying the teams themselves. So that's really, really useful.
Yes, I was not familiar with that book, so maybe we can also put that in the comments for everyone as well. The other thing, I know we had a question up there that I kind of want to make sure that we get to is that's obviously the team is a cohesive unit and them forming, but there's obviously, you talk a lot about the relationships that you have with other teams. And I think one of the things you're quite clear about is let's be clear about the kind of interaction that teams have with each other. Can you tell us a bit more about how teams have that conversation and how they engage with each other, and whether you need to have the same long-lasting relationships between teams, or whether that can be different as well?
It's interesting because what I've seen with some clients is that there's sort of an interpretation, for example, of collaboration, where we are talking as an interaction mode, meaning that it should have a specific goal, specific outcome we're trying to achieve, should be as specific as possible, so we know when we can stop the collaboration because we've achieved it. And it should have an expectation of how long this is going to last. Right? Is this 2 weeks that we need to work together full time, or we're going to do 1 day per week? So whatever it is, so you have a clear expectation between the two teams. But what I see with clients is that teams think of collaboration as the ongoing activities or dependencies they have on other teams, and that's more like the relationship between teams. We talk about specific interactions. So if you want fast flow, if you want to achieve that, we need teams to be more loosely coupled, so they have more ownership of the end-to-end service they're responsible for. But that doesn't mean that all the dependencies go away. So we have more autonomous teams in a way, but we also have clear expectations on when and how they should interact with others. Do we need to collaborate because there's a common problem, or maybe we are, let's say, migrating from a monolith to more kind of independent services? So maybe we need to collaborate to kind of set the boundary and understand what is sort of part of your service and what's going to be part of our service. Or it's maybe more of a facilitating sort of interaction where maybe we need help from another team that maybe have more expertise on continuous delivery or infrastructure as code, anything like that, any kind of capability that we need to get better at as a team, and we need help from another team. So that's facilitating, but again, with a specific expectation how long this is going to last. And that helps clarify a lot when and with which other teams should we interact and for how long. So moving away from that interpretation of collaboration specifically as sort of ongoing thing forever as actually, well-framed interactions for specific purpose is very helpful. At least if we want teams to have, faster flow and be more independent.
It's worth mentioning the enabling team at this point, the enabling team type, which we define.
Mm-hmm.
Enabling team is the only team type that doesn't really own any of the software. The enabling team is like a team of experts to kind of help multiple different teams at different points to bridge a capability gap or detect a problem. And because the enabling teams are working across multiple different teams across several weeks or months, they're in a great position to spot recurring problems, to identify, hey, well, actually, the team boundaries around here, around this particular service or something, don't really seem to match. We need to start thinking about how we're going to evolve those team boundaries. And so we've, technically speaking, from an organizational design perspective, that enabling team is playing a boundary spanning role, spanning across multiple different parts of the organization. And that's quite deliberate. It's a way of detecting things that are maybe misaligned or that were fine in the past but now need to change. And that is a key aspect of that kind of enabling team role, is to listening for those kind of signals to tell us where some of the boundaries in the organization are no longer effective and need to somehow change.
Yeah. I'm curious about the enabling teams. Do you see these in the same way as things like agile coaches that we may have seen, in other organizations? Or we were talking earlier about how individuals might change their role. Do you see where, people move from stream-aligned teams to becoming members of enabling teams? What sort of the makeup of those enabling teams look like?
Enabling teams are typically experts in a particular area. You might have an enabling team of one particular specific set of expertise. You might have for example, you might have an enabling team of people with machine learning expertise, and they're moving around multiple streamlined teams, helping them understand how to adopt machine learning.
I see.
Or you might have a group of people whose expertise is quite mixed. There's a case study in the book which talks about an enabling team that had a mixture of engineers, testers, architects, data people, and the purpose there was they were trying to introduce continuous delivery into an organization, and they had to have multiple different kinds of skills, but their focus was on the same kind of uplift for teams that they're working with. So it very much depends. The key aspect is that that enabling team there, the interaction with another team is short-lived, perhaps 2, 3, 4 weeks. In order to avoid the enabling team being a dependency. And that enabling team will potentially work with multiple different teams across the organization, detecting stuff that is needed. Perhaps it's missing from a platform, perhaps we're missing capabilities in multiple teams, perhaps we need to add new skills, perhaps we need to go in a new direction, perhaps we need to adopt a new technology, whatever. They're there to detect these things and help the teams to adopt something new. So it very much depends on the context. But the key behavior from people inside enabling teams is that they are acting in a facilitating way. They're facilitating other teams. They're not doing work on behalf of other people. They're not lecturing people. They are there to improve how these typically streamlined teams are doing their work. So it's a mindset and set of behaviors which is not so familiar in lots of organizations, but seems to be massively valuable.
Effectively, it's meeting the teams where they are. And again, the realization that teams are not all equal. And so, especially the larger the organization, you'll have teams with different background, different experience, different maturity, different kind of sets of skills inside the team. And so if we want to sort of bring up the level across teams, then we need to understand that different teams are going to need help with different things. So I often give the example of test automation. If you're just starting, you've never really done any test automation, the kind of help you need is very different from a team that has already been doing that for several months, and maybe they're more dealing with performance and other kind of problems. So the enabling teams need to have that perspective. So it can be quite different from, because people ask this very often, is this like a center of excellence? depends very much how the center of excellence works. If it's like kind of setting out standards and good practices for everyone to follow, that's not, at the end of the day, it's good in theory, but in practice, it's not very helpful. It's just actually possibly adding to the cognitive load that they already have. Oh, now we have this other thing we have to worry about, and now we have to do tests in this way, and we have to do, I don't know, provisioning in that way because we're being told that. So that's not helping teams to reduce cognitive load and go faster. So enabling teams are really mentoring and coaching and meeting the teams where they are. And there's another interesting aspect. Again, it's not something in the book, but that we've seen some of the more forward-thinking organizations applying the ideas of team topologies. They also realize that probably enabling teams should be, and especially that mentoring and coaching should be part of a career progression for, maybe for technical people. If you're a senior engineer, maybe at some point you should have done some mentoring and coaching rather than being the person that others depend on to do certain very specific types of work. Actually, you've helped sort of bring up the level across the organization or across certain teams by helping them learn and provide your insights rather than kind of just being a dependency because you're the senior person who knows more than the others. But like I said, it's just starting. We just had a conversation with a government client as well, where sometimes have very career paths that are set in stone, like the tester career and the developer career, and that makes it difficult to then allow people to grow and to become more sort of T-shaped, which you can, with enabling teams, can help with if you follow that approach, let's say.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned a government client there. One thing that I was thinking throughout this is this all requires the organization to be quite flexible and open to these changes you're suggesting. I'm sure you get the questions like, it's not going to work here, we can't do that, we are a certain type of industry, or we're too busy, or we're a certain type of industry. And here we have a good question. I think we have to ensure separation of duties for certain types of compliance. I'm sure you've worked through those many times. Any thoughts about how you make what might seem quite different work with perhaps regulated industries or organizations that are very busy?
So the key thing about compliance in general, whether it's SOX or anything else, is that we have to aim for a rapid flow of change. And we have to therefore avoid handoffs. There cannot be handoffs from one team to another, because that will slow down the flow of change. We also cannot have one team inspecting and approving the work of another team or multiple other teams. Again, that will slow things down. So the change is from. So let's say you've got a group of compliance experts, and they understand about regulatory compliance in healthcare or medical or financial services or whatever. They understand how this organization has decided to interpret the compliance regulations. In the past, they will be there inspecting the work of other teams and saying yes, no, that's not going to go out. You have to change it. That needs to change. That needs to change into those experts, those compliance experts, helping to accelerate the flow of change to the organization. And how do they do that? We kind of get their knowledge, and we help them. They help the organization to build self-service tools, typically through a kind of platform or API, to enable multiple independent streamlined teams to deliver changes rapidly, but in a compliant way. So we're leaning on that compliance expertise, but instead of expecting that we can check every single change, because we can't, there's too many changes and it's going too quickly. Instead of expecting to kind of validate or approve or deny changes, we're taking that expertise and baking it into something which is self-service, so that all changes are now flowing down in a compliant way. So it's a fundamental mind shift to switch from checking to accelerating or at least enabling a fast flow of change.
just to go back briefly on, how do you get started, and when you have these sort of challenges of being too busy, or or we think this requires a big organizational change. Actually, it's more about, I would say, even the types of teams, the enabling, the platform types of teams are more about the thinking around that. So I give you an example even of startups, even with 15, 20 people. Maybe you don't have enough people to have a platform team, enabling team, and so on, and streamline teams, but you can get the thinking in place. The thinking about platform means we're thinking about how do we reduce cognitive load for our engineers? How do we provide a better experience, better understanding of which services we should rely on, even if it's all maybe AWS or Google Cloud based, but what is the useful configuration? What is some recommended? We use this 3-4 services in this way, so you can get started faster. So that's already platform thinking, and the same for enabling. If we have some people who are more senior or have been in the organization longer, they should maybe dedicate some time to do the facilitating, to help maybe people who are newer to the organization or more junior to kind of learn the ways of working, learn why we done things this way, or maybe why the architecture is this way, so that we're not just sort of running after the problems, we're actually addressing the problems. And so that can start even if you don't have dedicated teams for those things.
Yes.
And then over time, that need will probably emerge. And for large organizations as well, you can just start having a team doing some facilitating work, even if they're not an enabling team yet. And so you can get the dynamics started.
With the compliance stuff, with the compliance stuff, it's always worth checking whether the regulations are actually really required. There's been a lot of work done. So Jez Humble, author of Continuous Delivery and co-author on the Accelerate book, has done plenty of work around SOX specifically, SOX compliance, and this separation of developer and operations person is not needed. Well, there's some very specific things that are needed, but go back to the regulations and actually work out what is actually needed. Because what the auditors want to see is a matching between what your stated policy is and what they can see in your audit trail usually, and it's important to bring to the surface what the organisation's interpretation of those compliance regulations actually is. Too often there's this assumption that we have to do all this crazy, really complicated stuff. A lot of the time that's not actually the case.
Yeah, and I think we're getting close to our time, so I'm just going to do one question. I know we have a question on the screen, but it was something I was thinking about as you were talking. You've obviously talked about large organizations, governments, and then startups. I know when I first became familiar with your work, it was the DevOps team, Topologies, and then afterwards I was like, oh, where did DevOps go? The book is not just about DevOps. I know you're also offering things for other teams. Like, is this something that any team could approach? Is this just technical teams? I know the question is about, could it work in ops? Could you talk to us about, how far?
When we launched the DevOps Topologies website, DevOps meant something different. DevOps meant the relationship between development and operations at the very least. Now it just means people who build infrastructure code, but it meant something different back then. So you could apply Team Topologies inside just say a platform or an infrastructure space or data. That's fine, because the Team Topologies patterns are what we call fractal. They're self-similar at multiple different zoom levels. And we do know there are organizations who are applying Team Topologies outside of technology, starting to apply to things like defining some service boundaries around, say, legal or HR or marketing. So, for example, in the legal department, hey, if you bring us a 3-page contract for less than $30,000, we'll turn it around, we'll validate it, and we'll get it back to you all ready to sign in 2 days. There's a service. It's not a software-defined service, but it's a service, and you can start to use patterns like X as a service interaction. So there's definitely ways in which some of the principles around Team Topologies, things like team cognitive load, fast flow, things like this can start to apply outside of technology.
I had an interesting discussion and the presentation with a consulting company in Norway, where they actually tried to apply Team Topologies to the whole organization. So, for example, their sales team works as sort of platform team. They consider themselves platform because they're not actually trying to sell. They're trying to help the people on the ground with the clients to be better informed and have better kind of tools to do their job. And the same for the leadership team. Also, they see themselves as a sort of platform. We're providing services to allow our team leads to better set the direction for their teams, find the necessary interactions with other teams and so on. So it was really fascinating. It's kind of early days, but we're seeing interest in kind of applying. There's some specific things that maybe are more technology focused, but many patterns or most patterns apply more broadly. So it will be interesting area to stay tuned and see what's coming up next. We will probably publish some examples on our website at some point.
That's great. And I think it really resonates with us as well. Obviously we largely build tools for software teams, but we're seeing this more and more that other teams are adopting similar patterns. So I want to thank you both. The time always flies. I know I had lots of other questions. We didn't get much to cognitive load. Maybe we can all come back and talk about that again next time. For our listeners, our watchers, check out teamtopologies.com. Lots of free resources. I know you also have online training. So lots of resources there to help everybody along their journey. And thank you so much for your time and for everyone for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
See you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Bye.